Welcome to The Business. I'm Lanre Akinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. This week on The Business, MTN and EcoBank sign a Pan-African mobile banking partnership to drive financial inclusion on the continent. Namibia drops plans to increase black ownership of businesses. Is the drive for economic empowerment across Southern Africa slowing down? And the World Bank says that the right reforms in South Africa could halve poverty by 2030. In this week's big story, Nigeria's President Buhari has announced that he will seek re-election in 2019. We look at what it could mean for business. And in the breakdown, we look at reform in Angola. Is now the time to invest in Africa's second biggest oil producer? Joining me throughout for commentary and insight is broadcaster and Africa watcher Vuyiswa Ngobongwana. And in part two, I'll be talking to William Pollen, program director at Invest in Africa. EcoBank and MTN have announced a new partnership to provide digital financial services across Africa. The focus of the partnership is on remittances, mobile savings and lending, and digital payments, and should be very good news for financial inclusion on the continent. EcoBank is active in 36 countries, making it the biggest Pan-African bank by geography. And MTN is the continent's biggest mobile operator. It's active in 20 markets and has over 200 million subscribers. Vuyiswa, I'd like to turn to you. This sounds like a very exciting partnership here. We know financial inclusion is a real issue across sub-Saharan Africa. We also know that the mobile phone has the potential to bridge that gap. You've got one of Africa's biggest banks and its biggest mobile operator coming together saying, we're going to join forces here. That's got to be good news. Well,
it's a match made in heaven, especially for African consumers. The pay-as-you-go customer seems to have been subsidizing the whole networks, really. And that seems, hopefully, will now be in a position to be addressed. And it's interesting for me as an observer of Africa to actually see how business thinking is evolving and how African entities are working more together, though of course I may be totally ignorant about who's behind the African leaders, but it certainly looks really good at the moment.
All right, thank you very much, Vuyiswa. Interesting one to watch. The need for financial inclusion in Africa is very dire, so hopefully this helps solve the problem. Namibia has dropped plans to force white-owned businesses to sell a minimum of 25% to black owners to increase black economic empowerment in the southern African country. It's an ongoing issue it's an ongoing theme across Africa, not just in Namibia, the need for more black participation in the economy, which is particularly pronounced in places like South Africa. Vuyiswa, you're South African. This is not a new debate for you, the need for economic equilibrium. We all know about black economic empowerment in South Africa. Interesting step here from Namibia. What does it tell us about the dynamics behind this?
Well, always liking to focus on the positive side of things. I like to think that they've learned from South Africa's experience. South Africa had similar regulations in place, but because the African majority are so far behind because of apartheid and white empowerment, they're so far behind they cannot take advantage of whatever percentage the government says should go to them.
Very interesting part of this is because the president in Namibia said that we're not dropping this because of opposition from white Namibians. He's saying that the people that would buy these, they don't have the resources and they don't have the capacity to act on this, which is not an issue with black empowerment that we often think of. Usually we think more about the inequity of it.
Precisely, and I think, I hope, having just said that the president of Namibia actually now focuses on showing the public what kind of mechanisms he's got in place to actually allow ordinary Namibians to have more access. And then perhaps in 2 or 3 years' time, we can talk about bringing back this 25% ownership on more realistic foundation.
Thank you very much, Vuyiswa. Black empowerment, easier said than done. Staying in Southern Africa, the World Bank said this week that South Africa could halve poverty by 2030 if it passes the right reforms. The World Bank has said that tackling corruption, providing policy certainty, and fixing things like higher education need to be the focus for the government. Vuyiswa, good news for South Africa. It could have poverty by 2030. The question is how? If it passes the right reforms. This is not new for South Africa. South Africa understands it needs to reform its economy. The question is, how can we go from the theoretical, in principle is what you need to do, to actually doing it?
Well, picking up on what dilemma Namibia is facing with regard to increasing empowerment of the majority, South Africa is now, based on crisis, really, crisis management, having to actually focus on dealing with the protests of the young generation that is going to inherit this mess if it's not dealt with, who are saying make fees and education a viable entity within South African life so that that generation can get the necessary education to take advantage of this empowerment, which is just nothing but a theoretical construct at the moment.
Policymakers understand this. They understand the legacy of apartheid. Just last week, I think the World Bank came out and said officially South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, and it's a legacy of apartheid. So the point I'm getting at here is we understand the problem. We kind of understand the policy prescriptions. It's the execution that's difficult here. It's not that simple to push through these kinds of reforms.
No, it's not that simple, but it's not impossible either.
Thank you very much, Vuyiswa. Tricky road ahead for economic reform in South Africa. For a big story this week, we look at Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari's announcement that he does intend to seek re-election in votes scheduled for next February. Now, the announcement is likely to meet with a mixed reaction. His time in office has divided opinion, but it does set the scene for an interesting contest between Buhari and any challenges next year. And it does raise very important questions about where Africa's biggest economy goes next. Vuyiswa, it's not going to come as a surprise to many Nigerians. There's been lots of speculation as to whether or not Buhari would seek a second term. He's not confirmed he intends to do so. Is this good news for Nigeria? Is this bad news for Nigeria? How should we react to this?
Well, it depends who you are. And as an observer with no axe to grind in this battle, I'm just not surprised, like you said, because he may be 75, but like many older African leaders, if there's enough encouragement for him to keep going, he will keep going. And in terms of securing business confidence, better the devil you know.
Yes, this is a key point, because the track record on the economy is something that has drawn quite a bit of criticism under Buhari. Nigeria went into recession last year, which was part of the oil price slumping the way it has. Do you think that criticism has been fair, or do you think that what's more important here is that we have some continuity, that we have at least some sense that, okay, something has started, can we continue? And as you said, what's the alternative?
I think I think continuity is more important for me at this point in time, because when it comes to the head of the government within Nigeria, for the ordinary Nigerian, it's almost irrelevant who's at the head, because the practical conditions of their daily life make absolutely no change whatsoever. But from an investor point of view, the same head is also reassuring, because an unknown entity is much more destabilizing for the economy as a whole.
Thank you, Vuyiswa. At the very least, it might provide some stability. For our breakdown this week, we look at Angola, where President João Lourenço is overlooking some of the most radical reform there is in Africa right now. He took over from José Eduardo dos Santos last September after almost 40 years in power. Many people expected him to be a bit of a puppet. Since then, he's gone after powerful members of the Angolan elite. He's reformed the foreign exchange regime in Angola. He's opening up the country to foreign investment and tourists, and overall has really surprised both Angolans and the international community. Angola is not a country that comes up very much in discussions about investing in Africa.
Because Angola had a dynasty. And, jobs for life for members of the president's family, etc. He's broken that understanding, because it falls in very easily into an African traditional mindset that you can move from being the head of the country and then your sons and daughters take over. It's easy to sell that to the population. But when you're teaching people about democracy, you have to break what may seem like good traditional ideas.
We often have this debate around, reform is hard, it's complicated, it's complicated. It doesn't get more complicated than Angola. Yet here we have a government that is, holding no punch, pulling no punches, and going after the most powerful people in the country. They've just charged the son of the former president, with massive fraud against the Angolan government. They've arrested and charged the former central bank governor. I mean, this doesn't happen in Africa. This is great, right?
Well, it does happening. Look at Zuma sitting in the dock. You know, a lot of people will be sitting in the dock over the next few years to come, because Africa is calling herself to account. No longer are we just pointing at the West and saying, oh, poor us with the neo-colonial yoke against us. We are now taking charge of our own empowerment, and we are calling to book those Africans who are hiding behind nationalism in order to secure their own individual well-being. And I'm really happy.
We have to leave it there. Okay. It's good to dream. Vuyiswa, thank you as always for all the insight and analysis. Always a pleasure having you on here.
Thank you.
Very exciting times for Angola. We'll have to see what happens. We'll take a break now. Join me in part 2 when I'll be talking to William Pullen, Program Director at Invest in Africa. Welcome back to The Business, where I'm delighted to be joined by William Pullen, Program Director at Invest in Africa, to talk about the continent's economic and investment prospects for 2018. William, thank you very much for joining me.
Pleasure.
I want to start with where most discussions about Africa's prospects start, which is growth. We've had 2 years of pretty subdued growth. We're finally getting a bit of good news. The World Bank is forecasting 3.2% for sub-Saharan Africa. In general, there are signs that growth is starting to pick up again after a pretty difficult period. How excited should we be?
I think we should be realistically excited, cautiously optimistic. All those cliches. I mean, the numbers I've seen move from 3.4 to 4.3 for 2018. But the danger is, as ever, that we talk about such a vast continent, and it's a patchwork quilt that you've got to navigate your way through, and that's the tricky part, and that's where the growth is.
But there are some pretty strong performers in there as well. So I'm looking at some IMF figures here. Ghana, 8.9%, Cote d'Ivoire, 7.3%, Ethiopia, 8.5%. I mean, these are strong growth figures, right? So it goes to your point around, we can't generalize here.
Sure, and I think, it's no great surprise that the numbers from some of those countries, they are non-oil exporting nations, so they've benefited from the downturn in the commodities prices. And as ever, there's winners and losers with every scenario. As the oil price is picking up again, maybe those sorts of markets will slip back, and you'll see the Nigerias, the Angolas, the Ghanas, etc., picking up again. There is sectors that are performing well across the continent consistently. You look at manufacturing, growing 6% from just 4 or 5 years ago. Services up 4%, all of which are indicative of a growing middle class, and I use that term loosely. But it's there to be. The answer is in the numbers. The number of people in what you would call a middle class category, and they're driving consumption.
There's a flip side here, which is that we've been here before. Since between 2000 and about 2014, when the commodities slump really started to bite, we had average growth of 5%. We had economies growing in the double digits. Ethiopia has recorded double-digit growth for many years, but we haven't necessarily seen the development impact. We haven't necessarily seen the impact in terms of job creation.
That is the number one of every government's inbox. Doesn't matter who they are, where they are, what their numbers say. Job creation is a huge challenge. When you've got 60-70% of an entire nation's population represented by people under 30, 35, that's not going to change overnight. So local content, jobs, those are always going to be top of a government's agenda, and as a result, they should be top of any smart business's agenda too.
We all know that Africa has its challenges when it comes to attracting investment, especially attracting foreign investment. Do you think that we can anticipate an improvement in terms of sentiment towards the continent as growth figures rebound, as commodities rebound?
I think so to some extent. I mean, look, would you rather be invested $10 in a market that's growing at 4.3% or $20 in a market that's growing at 2% like Europe is? And look at Europe. You've got Spain, Germany, UK. Who knows what lies ahead for those markets, coalitions. Brexit, etc.
Yeah, exactly, Brexit.
And then you could put Turkey into that bracket, who knows what lies ahead. So there's political uncertainty around every corner. Africa tends to get a more negative press on it, and yet the opportunity is there and the stability is there. The governance is improving across the continent. The Mobrahim Index, that's well quoted, has shown consistent improvements in all categories. So I think there's every reason to be positive. But you need to look for the sectors that are growing and in the markets that suit you. And for us, it's about a long-term mindset.
In 2016, the IMF says Sub-Saharan Africa had recorded the lowest growth in 20 years. Surely that sort of put people off a little bit. I take your point that, you know, if you look closely, but have you found it harder over the last 12 months or so to get people interested in Africa? Or are you seeing perhaps a maturing of the investor base?
I think you're seeing, a maturing of the investor base. I mean, surveys that have come out consistently now, 7-8 years, things like the EY Africa Attractiveness Survey that look at people currently invested in Africa, new investors, haven't changed from day one. People already invested in the continent remain positive, optimistic, they see the opportunities. People new, they go up and down with sentiment. So for those that are already invested, they can see and understand the opportunity. And it's like most things in life. You need to get on the ground. You need to see, smell and feel it and roll your sleeves up. And until you've done that, you will be making very speculative decisions.
You're on the ground. Elaborate on some of these opportunities. What would you be looking at? If you were one-on-one with a potential investor right now, what should they be looking at?
$64,000 question. Well, well, you've got massive opportunities driven by the consumption of the private sector. So I would look at things like healthcare, ICT, financial services, housing, energy, infrastructure. They're all increasingly receiving government support. Government's looking for PPPs on them, just like they are in Europe. You look at someone like Kenya, where 45% of the entire GDP is driven through the M-Pesa platform. You look at how Nigeria is coming back from its dependency on oil in terms of GDP. It's still heavily dependent for foreign currency from oil, 90% or thereabouts, but its actual GDP numbers, 10% on oil versus 20 only 5-6 years ago.
You're touching on a really key point here, which is the diversity of the investment profile across Africa, because we know it has natural resources, we know it has minerals, we know it has oil, but you know, you've talked about retail, you've talked about technology, you've talked about media, and all of these sectors are coming on stream, which ties into the commodities rebound. Is a potential flip side of us seeing the oil price coming back up that perhaps some of that momentum is lost? Maybe governments take their eye off the ball a little bit here.
I don't think so. Well, I hope not. I think governments are increasingly realizing that they have to diversify, and they're being held to account, more importantly. Social media is driving some of that, a more open media is driving that, and some of the governance schools and improvements are driving that. The stronger they have institutions on the ground, the more accountable they hold, the less they're going to take the eye off the ball. Look, I think the cash that African economies receive from commodities, and it's not just oil and gas, minerals, metals play a massive part of that, is driven through their exports to China, by and large. Still at 30% of all of Africa's exports going to China, and of that 30%, you're looking at 80 to 90% being in commodities. So it's still very, very important to the cash flow of Africa, if you like, but the balance sheet is being driven by the fundamentals. And when you look at those, you start to see growth from the private sector, middle class consumption, exactly the sort of goods and services that people expect and want in Europe and the States. And that's where I see the longer term opportunities.
Let's talk a little bit more about commodities. Oil breached $70 for the first time in 3 years. You do a lot of work in Ghana. Surely this is good news for countries that do export oil. It has to be good news for countries like Nigeria, Angola, even Algeria that have really, really suffered. Should we be celebrating the return of oil, even if there's some potential downside here?
I'm not sure celebrating, but I think looking forward to the opportunities it should create. I mean, we've been here before. Lessons have to be learnt. And if they're not, we've seen that ultimately governments pay the price. People expect revenue from these national goods to benefit them, whether that be directly through jobs or indirectly through improvements in services and infrastructure. Those lessons will no doubt continue to be learned. But certainly you look at the sort of programs that Ghana have successfully put in place the last 2-3 years, the IMF package that has been by and large received as a success, the capping of inflation coming right the way down to sort of 11% from 22, those sort of numbers. It can be done, and it has to be done.
I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Do you think governments are learning some of those lessons? Are you seeing evidence? Could you point to any governments where you think that, look, the penny's dropped here, we can't just keep doing business as usual, we have to adapt, evolve, we have to move our economies forward?
Well, we're going to find out, right? I mean, the proof is in the pudding. We've got some big elections coming up. Nigeria is the obvious one, South Africa. And those two economies still massively disproportionately affect all conversations on Africa and the numbers that we've been talking about. So it's important to strip those two out most of the time to get a fairer picture. Yes, I think we will be seeing that. I mean, who would have thought this time last year we'd be where we are on Zimbabwe?
Good point. Very good
likewise
point.
on South Africa. But who would have thought we'd be where we are this time last year on the States or on the UK or on anywhere else, quite frankly? So risk is in the eye of the beholder. And I think that, you know, if we've learned one thing in the last 15, 18 months, it's not to try and predict the future, certainly not from a political standpoint.
There's growing resilience around that. You make an important point, which is that, look, first of all, political risk is a global phenomenon. You'll find it anywhere. But it has been interesting to see that, you know, we've had a coup in Zimbabwe, we've had the election dispute in Kenya, which we haven't touched on. And, you know, 10, 15 years ago, you'd have people packing their bags and leaving, you know, and taking their money with them. Our economy is more resilient now. People sort of starting to understand that, look, political risk in Africa is not this scary, crazy thing that you might think it is if you just watch CNN.
I think so. I'm glad you called it a coup and not me, because I'm not sure there's
supposed coup, just for the record.
So I think you look at Kenya. I mean, yes, there was paralysis for 6-7 months last year. You know, our business was personally impacted. I think everybody was, and yet now it feels like the market is set for really taking off there. And it's no great surprise that a lot of the winners from the last 2-3 years have been in East Africa, the sort of less oil-dependent nations, less commodity-dependent. So I would say watch that space, but very much we would expect lessons to be learnt on the ground.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I do want to get one last thing from you, William. If you had to pick your top 3 markets for 2018 or your top 3 sectors, what would they be?
Top 3 markets or sectors? Wow. I couldn't take my eye off Kenya. I think so much has been held back from last year's postponed elections that there's almost like the floodgates are waiting to open. I think the fundamentals look strong for Rwanda, Ethiopia. And I'm excited by what I see in Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, those markets too.
All right, thank you very much, William. As always, take a close look at Africa. And as you said earlier, you have to be on the ground if you really want to know what's going on. No point just watching the news. From all of us here at The Business, thank you for watching. Please join us again next time.